So my name's Paul Skidmore. I'm Director of Strategy at the Tony Blair Africa Governance Initiative. Before that, as was mentioned earlier, I worked in the Office of the President in Sierra Leone and also earlier in Rwanda. I have to say that after that sort of brilliant and inspirational talk, I feel a bit like I have throughout my life, which is somebody that always buys technologies just after they become obsolete. So I always buy the latest mobile phone immediately before the new model comes out, the latest laptop immediately before Intel announces some super new chip. And right now I feel pretty much like a guy who brought an Etch-a-Sketch to an iPad party. And maybe technology is not a bad metaphor for what we're talking about here. In a sense, what we're kind of grappling with is, are the sort of technologies of reform developed in some parts of the world transferable to other parts of the world in the way that mobile phones, for example, have been in such a transformational way? And if they are, what are the kind of catch-up technologies, the sorts of technologies which will allow countries to get to the sorts of service delivery standards that we experience here in the OECD? I fear that my sort of take on that is going to be much less exciting than Christian's, because I guess my focus is going to be on what we see at AGI as some of the very basic technologies that help leaders in post-conflict and fragile states do the sort of very basics of service delivery in countries that haven't even enjoyed those basics. I want to talk a bit about, I guess, our experiences of the differences, although they're very obvious in some sense, between OECD and fragile states contexts, but also talk about some of the similarities which perhaps don't get talked about quite as often, and see whether there's a way of thinking about approaches to public services which can sort of recognise both. I think that although what I say is very different to what Christian's been talking about, there are going to be some common themes around capacity, themes around the importance of leadership, themes around the importance of political context and understanding politics. So a very quick word about who we are first. AGI was founded in 2007 by Tony Blair after he left office to take forward the commitment that he'd shown to Africa as Prime Minister through things like the Golden Eagles agenda, but also through things like the Commission for Africa, which have highlighted the role of good governance, the role of capacity in enabling African countries to be solid partners in development as a critical issue. And he wanted to see how in very practical ways he could support some of Africa's leaders with the challenge that he could empathise with, to use Christian's word, as a leader himself, which is how to bridge the gap between vision and implementation. What he heard time and again from leaders is that they knew very clearly where they were trying to go, but as they sat behind their desk in the Office of the President, actually making it happen was incredibly difficult. And so what we try and do is support those leaders in two ways, both through Tony's role himself and the relationship that he has with our presidents, a kind of peer-to-peer conversation that can only really happen between people that have shared that common experience of trying to lead government, and by having teams of people on the ground working in institutions in and around the President and their kind of key agencies. So the Office of the President, Office of the Prime Minister, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Agriculture, whatever it might be. I want to talk a bit about what we focus on in that work, but before I do, I want to, I think, ask all of us to try and practice a bit of this professional empathy. Christian talked a lot about that in the context of users. I want us to practice it a little bit in the context of leaders, actually, and what it's like to be a leader in one of these countries, one of these settings. First of all, you come into office and you know that you have the expectations of an entire country on your shoulders. You know that if you fail, people aren't just going to give up on you and vote for the next guy, but they might very well give up on politics altogether and go back to conflict. So the expectations couldn't be higher. Yet your experience is that on your first day in the office, before you kind of even get into your office, you walk past a queue of 25 people who are all waiting to see you, who all say that their problem is urgent and that only you can fix it. You pick up your strategy document, your poverty reduction strategy, and it has 150 indicators in it, 150 goals, but no plans about how you're actually going to make any of those things happen. You call up the Minister of Finance, but before you can even say a word, he says, I'm sorry, we only actually have half of the money that we thought we did, so we can't deliver anywhere near what we thought we were able to when we promised it before. You start getting calls from the donors who want to know what your priorities are, but then you tell them and then they get very cross if their priorities aren't on the list as well. You think, well, maybe my staff, my brilliant team of staff will be able to help, so you call in the permanent secretary of the ministry or whatever, and say, you've looked at the organisational chart, and he says, I'm sorry, Minister, but I know there's 100 people on there, but only 10 of them ever show up for work. You get the picture. This is an unbelievable set of expectations on the shoulders of people with very, very weak capacity around them to actually meet those expectations. So into that picture, what we at AGI try and do is support leaders with what we hear from them are three sort of critical capacities. And we call them the 3 Ps. Everyone's got to have one of those. Yeah. The first P is prioritization. And you'll see that we practice what we preach because we have only got 3 Ps and Christian has 4 Cs. What we mean by prioritization is that, and it's sort of self-evident really, but you can only get things done if you've got a focus on a narrow, manageable number of things. And that sounds like common sense, yet as I've said, we all have read strategy documents that have tens or hundreds of goals so that everyone can sort of be happy that their thing is in the strategy. So prioritization is actually really, really difficult to do because it involves making choices, it involves creating winners and losers, and it's something that is especially hard to do in fragile states contexts because everything is a priority. It really is incredibly difficult to say that actually we can't fix this problem with maternal health because something else has to come first. So prioritization is even harder, yet even more important because with weak capacity you just can't get everything done. So really focusing on how to help governments themselves focus is one of the things that we try and do. One of the ways that we've done that in Rwanda, for example, is working with the government on the Kivu National Leadership Retreat, which is a sort of annual meeting of all of the key figures in government and wider society, at which there is debate and argument and the presentation of evidence about what the priorities should be for the coming year based on the experience today. And what we've tried to do is help make sure that that process is as effective as possible at arriving at priorities. So when we first started working in Rwanda, the retreat ended up with something like 137 priorities. Last year they had 11. So by creating a sense of what good prioritization looks like, the processes that you can use, both technical and political, I think we can really help countries do make those very difficult choices. The second P is around planning. So if you've got your priority, how do you actually get it done? How do you know what it is that you have to achieve? What we find, and I don't want to sort of hate too much on strategies, because strategies are important. I'm a director of strategies. They're kind of my meat and drink. But strategies are often a very good kind of sense of where you're going, but they don't tell you how to get there. They don't tell you what, as a minister, you're supposed to do on Monday. They don't tell you what you're supposed to expect your staff to do. So really helping the planning function of ministries and governments is critical. So in Sierra Leone, for example, in 2002, when they launched a program to abolish user fees for pregnant women and children under 5, it failed almost immediately because none of the planning had happened. This time around in 2010, when 2009, sorry, when the president announced, a different president, I should emphasize, announced that he wanted to do it. We worked very intensively with his staff, with the Ministry of Health staff, on those planning competencies, so that when the program was eventually launched this year, it didn't suffer the same fate and is in fact still going strong. The third P is around performance management, and I mean that partly in the sense of the sort of formal systems of accountability, the formal systems of monitoring, of how you collect data to see whether you're on track and so on. And we do some of that. We work with, for example, again in Sierra Leone, the president on his system of performance contracts that he asks each of his ministers to sign as part of his commitment to running the country like a business. But actually, performance management in government is not just about that big stuff. It's actually often about the very small stuff. And more than anything, it's about how people spend their time. So one of the things that we work a lot on is things like diaries and scheduling and organising creating a kind of structure around leaders' time so that they're spending it on the right things. One of the ministers that we work with in one of our countries, we did some analysis for him, and we found that he was spending 95% of his time on issues that weren't his priorities. So creating more of that structure is a simple but crucial thing in enabling leadership to be more effective. So I've talked a bit about what we see as these sort of core capacities. I want to talk a little bit about the experience of, I guess, trying to take things from one context into another. Because on the one hand, everything is different. In talking about health in Sierra Leone, you're talking about a country which has 3 doctors per 100,000 people. The UK has 230 doctors per 100,000 people. I think you were saying earlier, Marcus, you worked in Uganda. As I understand it, Uganda today has about, even when you include aid, Uganda has 1/3 of the revenues per capita that the US had a century ago. So we're talking about completely different contexts, and that's bound to matter, and it does. There are layers of incentives and networks that that kind of feel impossible to comprehend as an outsider coming in, and they are. You know, who fought with who during the Civil War? Those sorts of things matter a lot. Even where people have formal qualifications, their practical experience of organisational life, their practical experience of work is completely different. So one of our team was working with somebody on how to create a presentation that they were being asked to do for the minister. And our very enthusiastic team member got all excited about giving some PowerPoint training, and then it turned out that the person she was talking to had spent most of his adult life in a refugee camp in Tanzania and had never really used a computer. So the fact that he had a degree was kind of here nor there. There are assumptions that you don't even know that you carry that you bring into that kind of work, and you kind of realise you have them when you get found out. We do quite a lot of stuff on, as I said, tracking and monitoring, and one of the tools that we've tried to use from time to time is just a basic kind of Excel tracker that says, this is what we're trying to do, are we on track, and then has a RAG rating, a red, amber, green rating. And we were working with somebody in Sierra Leone on that, and then they said, why does it have to be red? Why can't it be a different colour? And we were sort of, well, it's because it's, you know, traffic lights. And then they sort of point out that there are no functioning traffic lights in Freetown at the moment. So why would it be obvious that red, amber, and green should be the colours? So those assumptions don't get exposed until you really use them. And above all, there's this point about prioritisation. I think certainly when I went in, I didn't have any sense that prioritisation could be a bad thing. But when you are in that context long enough, you understand that it's pretty difficult for people to say something is a priority and something's not, because everything feels like a priority. So for all those differences, though, I think that there are some similarities. One is about leadership, actually, that leadership, even in those very different settings, really comes down to a lot of the same things, about having vision, about communicating it, but also about really grappling with the detail of getting things done, about using people well, about putting them in the right places. When Tony Blair talks to presidents, there's an awful lot of kind of nodding on both sides from the common experiences of statecraft. Another thing that doesn't change is change, actually. Change management as a sort of discipline, it's very easy to get kind of carried away and probably over-systematise it in some ways. But there are sort of core things about how change does and doesn't happen in organisations which I think are very similar, to do with how you create a sense of urgency, to do with how you build coalitions, to do with how you grapple with potential spoilers. And finally, change is always about politics, and therefore, as you were saying earlier, it's not enough to simply have technical answers to things. You have to be able to have political answers. And yes, that politics is very different. It might be about ethnicity, or it might be about family, or it might be about sort of hidden networks, but nevertheless, it's the same set of challenges that you face trying to get reform done in the OECD. So I guess my argument would be that we need hybrid approaches. I think Tim Kelsall spoke here a little while ago and brought up this idea of hybrid approaches. It's one I find very attractive, that build on domestic, homegrown solutions, but link them to international best practices where they're available. And a number of the things that I've talked about are, I think, quite good examples of that. The Kivu Leadership Retreat is not something we invented and kind of going in and said you should do this. It's something that already existed, but which you can help to make perhaps more effective. Performance contracts in Sierra Leone were not our idea, they were President Karoma's idea, rooted in his experience as a businessman in Sierra Leone and what had made him effective there. But we could help make those processes more useful. In the work that we're doing in the Cabinet Secretariat in Liberia, we didn't create the cabinet, what we're only trying to do there is help the process of cabinet be more effective, be more focused on the right things by helping think through the sort of triage process around what issues get to cabinet and which issues don't, helping think through the sort of recording mechanisms that you want so that follow-up can actually happen. So I think that that means a couple of things in terms of lessons. One is around actually this idea of co-design, not just at the level of users, although that's absolutely critical, but also within government, that you can help governments work together with outsiders to sort of forge these hybrid approaches that I've described. One is about having very practical people, but what is required in these settings is not just sort of consultants who know technically what the right answer is, but people who are prepared to kind of get into the kind of weeds of how you actually make it happen on the ground. And the third is people who get the politics, and I don't mean who practice the politics, but who can understand what it means to operate in a political environment and the kinds of incentives that are at work. So I think I want to wrap it up there, really. I think that there are huge amounts that can be learnt in the developing world from experiences in the OECD, and actually vice versa. But I think that to do that, we have to be able to think about technologies that one copies but then makes relevant to the local context, rather than sort of specific policies that we're trying to impose in a situation where they didn't in any sense come from.
Thank you.